The studio lights felt hotter than usual as Mikey Day walked out onto the stage, applause swelling in waves that bounced off the glossy floor. He wore his familiar easy grin, the one audiences trusted, the one that suggested nothing could possibly go wrong. Jimmy Fallon met him halfway, arms wide, the band punctuating the moment with a playful riff. From the outside, it looked like any other late-night appearance. Two comedians, mutual admiration, a promise of laughs. But beneath the surface, something tight and unspoken traveled with Mikey, coiled and restless. They settled into their seats, the desk between them like a friendly border. Jimmy leaned forward, eyes bright, launching into warm banter about Mikey's recent sketches and the way he could flip from absurd to heartfelt in a single beat. Mikey laughed, nodded, played along. The audience laughed too. The rhythm was familiar, comfortable. Yet every time Jimmy's questions drifted toward Mikey's work environment, toward jokes about pressure, deadlines, and behind-the-scenes chaos, Mikey's smile flickered, just slightly, like a light bulb about to burn out. Jimmy, sensing something interesting, pushed a little harder. He joked about how comedy was supposed to be fun, how everyone should just relax and enjoy the ride. It was meant to be harmless. It landed wrong. Mikey leaned back, crossed his arms, then leaned forward again, eyes suddenly sharp. He laughed, but the sound was thinner now. "Yeah," he said. "Fun. That's one word for it." The audience chuckled, assuming it was a setup. Jimmy smiled, ready for the punchline. None came. Instead, Mikey continued, voice steady but edged. He spoke about the grind of constantly having to be on, about how jokes were rewritten at the last second, about how the public only ever saw the polished result and never the exhaustion underneath. The band quieted. The laughter softened, then stopped. Jimmy tried to redirect, tossing out a self-deprecating quip, but Mikey didn't bite. For the first time that night, the room felt divided. Mikey gestured toward the audience, not accusing, but honest. "People think comedians don't get tired," he said. "That we can just keep smiling because that's the job." He paused, swallowing something heavy. "But sometimes the smile gets used against you." Jimmy's expression shifted, concern, surprise, a hint of defensiveness. He nodded, tried to empathize, saying he understood pressure, that late night was its own beast. But his words came out practiced, safe. Mikey noticed. He always noticed. "You're right," Mikey replied. "You do understand pressure. But you also understand power." The word landed with a thud. A murmur rippled through the audience. Cameras caught Jimmy blinking, recalibrating. Jimmy laughed it off, a reflex, and joked about how deep the conversation had suddenly become. He suggested they play a game, something silly to lighten the mood. The band started up again, but Mikey raised a hand, not angrily, just firmly. "No," he said. "I think this is the moment people don't usually get to see." The band stopped. Silence stretched, uncomfortable and electric. Mikey spoke faster now, not shouting, but no longer cushioning his words. He talked about how comedians were often expected to be grateful just to be invited onto certain stages, how questioning anything could brand you as difficult. He mentioned moments, without names, where jokes were trimmed, ideas softened, edges sanded down for the sake of palatability. "Comedy loses something when it's always trying to be safe," he said, eyes locked on Jimmy. "And sometimes the people who decide what's safe don't realize what they're cutting away." Jimmy straightened in his chair. His smile had vanished, replaced by a measured calm. He reminded Mikey that the show was about joy, about bringing people together at the end of a long day. "There's a difference between honesty and turning this into something it doesn't need to be," he said carefully. That was the spark. Mikey leaned forward, hands flat on his knees. "That's the thing," he replied. "Who decides what it needs to be?" His voice cracked just a little, and that crack did more than any raised voice ever could. The audience sat frozen, caught between empathy and shock. This wasn't rehearsed. This wasn't a bit. Jimmy tried again to regain control, gently suggesting they take a breath, maybe cut to commercial. Producers shifted off camera. A stage manager hovered at the edge of the set. Mikey noticed all of it and shook his head. "This is live," he said. "This is real. And if we can't handle real for a few minutes, then what are we even doing?" The words hung in the air, daring anyone to challenge them. Jimmy opened his mouth, then closed it. For a split second, the host looked less like a seasoned professional and more like someone genuinely unsure. He cleared his throat and reminded Mikey of the format, the time constraints, the responsibility to the audience at home. Mikey stood up. The movement was sudden enough to make people gasp. He wasn't storming, wasn't shouting. He simply stood, straightened his jacket, and looked out at the crowd. "I didn't come here to fight," he said quietly. "I came here to be honest. If that doesn't fit the format, then maybe I don't either." Jimmy rose halfway from his chair, hands out, trying to de-escalate. "Mikey, hey, let's just..." But Mikey shook his head again, a sad smile touching his lips. "This is the part they cut," he said softly. "Not tonight. But later." Producers moved in closer now. The band waited, uncertain. The red light on the main camera blinked, still rolling. Mikey took one last look at Jimmy, not angry, not bitter, just disappointed, and stepped away from the desk. As he walked toward the exit, the audience didn't know what to do. Some clapped hesitantly. Others sat in stunned silence. Jimmy called after him, voice tight, trying to salvage the moment, to say something that would bring it back to safe ground. Mikey didn't turn around. The studio felt smaller as he disappeared behind the curtain, leaving behind a room full of unanswered questions, a host struggling to regain his footing, and a show that had just slipped out of its carefully controlled rhythm. And as the cameras finally cut away, everyone knew they had just witnessed something that would not be forgotten, no matter how hard anyone tried to smooth it over later. The moment Mikey disappeared behind the curtain, the studio exhaled in a way that felt almost physical. Jimmy stood frozen for half a second longer, staring at the space Mikey had occupied, before turning back toward the desk. The applause sign blinked uncertainly, flashing once, then stopping. The band leader glanced at the producers, waiting for a cue that didn't come. Millions of viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing they'd just witnessed something that wasn't supposed to happen. Jimmy finally sat down, smoothing the front of his jacket with a practiced motion that didn't quite hide the tension in his hands. He forced a smile, one that had carried him through countless awkward moments before, but this time it felt thinner, stretched. "Well," he said, letting out a breathy laugh. "That was unexpected." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, more out of loyalty than genuine amusement. In his earpiece, voices overlapped, producers urging him to move on, to cut to commercial, to regain control. Jimmy nodded subtly, eyes flicking toward the camera. He made a brief, vague comment about respecting honesty and passion, then tossed to a break. The band played louder than usual, almost aggressively cheerful, as the screen faded out. Backstage, the atmosphere was nothing like the polished calm of the set. Staff members clustered in low-voiced groups, some shocked, some irritated, others quietly impressed. Mikey stood near a row of equipment cases, breathing slowly, grounding himself. A production assistant approached, hesitant, saying they needed him to wait. Mikey shook his head gently. "I've said what I needed to say," he replied. "I'm good." Security didn't escort him this time. They simply walked alongside him, unsure whether they were protecting the show or the guest. As Mikey moved down the hallway, a few crew members caught his eye and nodded, subtle gestures of support that spoke volumes. Others avoided looking at him entirely. Outside, the cool night air felt unreal after the heat of the studio lights. Mikey paused on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, listening as the muffled sounds of the show continued behind thick walls. His phone buzzed almost immediately, texts from friends, fellow comedians, people who had been watching live. Some messages were full of concern, others full of gratitude. "You said what we are all thinking," one read. Mikey closed his eyes for a moment, letting that sink in. Inside the studio, Jimmy returned from commercial with renewed energy, launching into the next segment as if speed alone could erase what had happened. But the rhythm was off. Jokes landed late. The audience laughed a second slower than usual. Jimmy felt it too, even as he pushed forward. Years of experience told him not to dwell, not to let the moment breathe any longer than it already had. Still, every glance toward the empty chair reminded him of the conversation he hadn't finished. When the show finally wrapped, Jimmy retreated to his dressing room, loosening his tie and dropping onto the couch. The adrenaline drained, leaving behind a heavy silence. A producer joined him, tablet in hand, already scrolling through social media reactions. Clips of the exchange were spreading fast, captions arguing over who was right, who crossed the line, whether it was brave or reckless. "He caught us off guard," the producer said carefully. "But people are talking. A lot." Jimmy nodded, staring at the floor. "That's not always a good thing," he replied. He replayed the moment in his head, the crack in Mikey's voice, the word power, the way the room had shifted. Part of him felt defensive, another part uncomfortably seen. He prided himself on kindness, on being the guy everyone liked. That night had challenged that image in a way he hadn't expected. By morning, the story had taken on a life of its own. Headlines framed it as a meltdown, a protest, a clash of egos. Pundits debated whether Mikey had been unprofessional or refreshingly honest. Fans dissected every second of footage, slowing it down, reading expressions, assigning motives. Memes appeared alongside serious think pieces. The internet did what it always did, simplified something complicated into sides. Mikey woke up to the noise and turned his phone face down. He made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the city wake up. He didn't regret what he'd said, but he understood the cost. Doors might close. Invitations might quietly stop coming. Still, there was a strange calm in knowing he hadn't swallowed his words for the sake of comfort. Later that day, he released a short statement, not an apology, not an attack. He wrote about honesty, about the pressure to keep things light even when they aren't, about respecting the platform while also respecting yourself. He didn't mention Jimmy by name. He didn't need to. Jimmy read the statement alone in his office. He leaned back, exhaling, recognizing the restraint in Mikey's words. After a long pause, he typed out his own response, acknowledging that live television could be messy, that conversations sometimes went places no one planned, and that there was value in listening even when it was uncomfortable. It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't a dismissal either. The days that followed were quieter, but not forgetful. Industry conversations shifted subtly. Comedians spoke more openly in interviews about burnout, about boundaries, about who controlled the narrative. Some thanked Mikey privately. Others kept their distance, wary of association. The show continued, as shows always do, but with a slightly sharper awareness of the tightrope between authenticity and control. Weeks later, Mikey and Jimmy crossed paths at an industry event. There were cameras nearby, but not rolling live. They exchanged a look, awkward, respectful, unfinished. Jimmy offered a hand. Mikey took it. No speeches, no public reconciliation, just a brief moment that suggested neither saw the other as a villain. The audience would keep arguing, replaying, choosing sides. But for the two people at the center of it, the clash had already settled into something quieter and more complicated. A reminder that even in a world built on laughter, truth has a way of breaking through the script.